Good morning, everybody, and welcome to this bright and sunny Monday morning webinar on schools financial update during COVID-19. I hope you're all well during these challenging times and that you haven't gone completely stir crazy at being locked up. My name is Alex Makinson. I will be your presenter today for the next sort of 45 minutes or so. I do wonder how many of you have joined us from your sofa. If you're still in your pajamas, please as you can see, I've dressed for the occasion. I've put a shirt and tie on today. And it almost makes me feel like a little bit normal, really, like I'm back presenting to you at a hotel rather than at the end of a camera. Now, a little bit of housekeeping just to go through. This is normally where I talk about fire alarms, toilet locations, and the well-deserved tea and coffee break. Sadly, there is no break today, so please ensure that you've got a nice strong cup of tea or coffee in front of you, because I think you're going to need it. Now, I have a fair bit of what I'm calling technology housekeeping to run through with you, and forgive me for this, it does seem easier to present in a room than it does down a microphone. So first of all, I am sat here at home. I banned my children from coming into my study, so hopefully I won't be interrupted. I've even bribed them to stay off their mobile phones and tablets to ensure that I have my full bandwidth to be able to broadcast to you today. I can't tell you how much chocolate this webinar has cost me. Obviously, I can still have a catastrophic failure of the internet on my end. This is, at the end of the day, a home connection. And equally, I have no control rather over what goes on your end. We will be recording a copy of this webinar. So worst case scenario, if all things fail, we'll just email a copy over to you. Now, webcams do often freeze for a number of reasons. Mine always seems to freeze in the most unattractive pose ever. If this does happen, you have a couple of things that you can do. You can log back out and log back in. It's a bit like turning your computer off and on, really, and that seems to resolve it. Or, assuming you can still hear me and see the slides, then you can just ignore it. If for some reason the audio fails and you can't hear me for some reason, then there is a number in the control panel which you can call and listen in through your mobile. I do, however, strongly recommend that you close down all of your other programs, whether that be emails and websites, so that your computer is just focusing on this broadcast and that I have your ultimate attention really here. For those of you that are new to GoToWebinar, then you should have in front of you a split screen, one containing my obviously lovely face, sorry about that, and the other my presentation slides that I'm going to go through with you. And usually somewhere over to your right, you have got a control panel with a little red arrow on it. Within this control panel is a number of very important things. Firstly, there is the audio section to give you those telephone numbers to call in case the audio fails. Secondly, within the document section is a copy of today's slides, but please don't download them now. Along with our 2020 Academy Benchmarking Report, which enables you and your school to compare yourselves to that of other schools. And please note that that report can be used by non-academies, because strangely enough, academies are also schools at the end of the day. Feel free to download both documents at your leisure, but don't do so now. Just do so at the end, obviously, at the webinar, because it could affect your internet speeds. Thirdly, there is a question box within the control panel in which you can ask questions, and please feel free to do so. However, I am sat here in my study on my own. I'm having to talk to you. I'm having to read my slides and click 2 or 3 buttons on my computer. Now, for a man, that's probably 2, 3, or 4 things more than anyone can cope with. So whilst your questions are most certainly welcomed, obviously I will be unable to read them and answer them until probably the end of the webinar, but I do promise you that I will come back to you by the end of it. Now, I've got 45 of you here today, so there's quite a few, which is good. If you do have any questions, please note they are all confidential, so none of the other delegates do get to see what you're writing, only I get to see what you're writing, and equally I can reply to them confidentially as well. And in my books, there's no such thing as a stupid question, so please feel free to write them. I do note that I have muted all of the delegates' microphones and cameras, so no one can hear or see you. You should only be able to hear and see me, and fingers crossed, it just stays that way going forward. Now, this is going to be an interactive webinar. I can almost see the shocks on all of your faces now. Maybe even one or two of you scrambling to get a pen and paper and a calculator. You thought this was going to be a nice and easy Monday morning, didn't you? Well, don't worry. You don't need anything. All I'm going to do is ask you a couple of questions over the webinar, which you can answer with your mouse. And don't be afraid to answer, because no one gets to know what your individual answers are. Not even I know what your personal answers are. But it's a nice way to break up the webinar and to allow everybody to see what we're doing globally, or what we're doing in this webinar, really. Now, that's the housekeeping, quite a bit of it really there, and forgive me for that. The aim of the webinar today, now the aim is to clarify some of the more detailed points surrounding schools, to put aside some of the myths and hopefully answer a few questions and concerns that you may have all at the same time. Now, this webinar is aimed specifically at the education sector. Some of the rules and regulations won't certainly apply to businesses, so please don't try and use them in any other context. And just to keep the lawyers happy, this webinar doesn't constitute any advice, but please feel free to contact us if you do. Now then, this is where I have to multitask and do many things all at the same time. So hopefully this works. A little bit about me. My name again is Alex Makinson. I'm a partner at Mitchell Charlesworth. And one of my areas of expertise is that in education, whether that be schools, academies, independent nurseries. I've been a governance trustee myself at a number of schools, so hopefully I do know a little bit about education finance, and that's the reason why I'm here talking to you today. A little bit about my firm, and for those that do know me, you may have noticed I've recently moved firms. I'm now with Mitchell Charlesworth, which is part of the Creston Group, one of the UK's leading advisors to the education sector, I think acting for over 500 trusts at the last count. What perfect timing from me, that's all I can say. 9 months of planning and I couldn't foresee one small, simple global pandemic. All I can say is gold star to you if you put pandemic on any of your risk registers. But one thing I can tell you is over the next year or so, you're all going to be reviewing your risk registers and critical incident policies, and I can guarantee you it's going to take absolutely hours to write, and you're going to have massive sections going forward on the impact and planning for future pandemics. So let's get started. There's quite a bit to cover on the agenda. I'm going to focus on the top two items, furloughing and agency workers costs. Why? Because they're the most complicated and the most detailed items. And then hopefully I'm going to whiz through the rest of the items on the agenda fairly quickly. So let's start with furloughing for schools. Now, I'm not going to go through any of the general items when it comes to furloughing. I'm going to make an assumption that you do know something about furloughing. So I'm not going to talk about the minimum 3-week periods, the 80% £2,500, the letters and the agreements you have to have with employees and all of that. Why? Because I think any HR advisor, employment lawyer can answer that, and you probably do already know it. What I am going to do is talk about some of the more detailed issues around furloughing at schools and for educational establishments. and hopefully that'll answer some of the concerns you may have. So I've got a question for you all, first of all, which is, have you furloughed any staff? And I'm going to try and launch a poll here today. And let's hope this works, fingers crossed. Brilliant. Hopefully on your screen now, you will see a blue box with some answers. Has your school furloughed any staff? Please click yes, no, considering. I won't leave it open too long. 35% of you have voted so far, up to 40%. It's climbing. A few of you are obviously frantically trying to click on your buttons to get through here. I'm just going to leave that one open for probably 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, last chance, 2, 1. I'm going to close that poll now. Poll has been closed. Okay, now then, I can see that someone has furloughed staff, and I do know a number of schools that have actually furloughed staff. I got a phone call from one of my clients a few days ago, and hadn't spoken to me before yesterday, or a few days ago, to be honest with you. And she said to me, Alex, I've furloughed staff. And I said to her, wow, I'm impressed. You furloughed staff? And she said, yes, I have, Alex. And, wonderful. And then I sat back and I said, oh dear, you furloughed staff? Have you really? Wow. And she said, Alex, forgive me, but you sound like you were contradicting yourself there. And I said, well, I was really. I thought I'd just follow government guidance, which is tell you one thing and then possibly change it a little bit later. And that's what I'm going to go through with you today, which is the government guidance, the original guidance, the updated guidance, and the current guidance we have on furloughing. And hopefully that will answer some questions. But before I do, I'm going to share the outcome of that poll with you. So fingers crossed it comes on your screen now. And wow, 64% of you have not furloughed any staff. Now that's not a big surprise. 5% of you have, and 21% of you are considering. So for me, to you, what that tells me is, of the 5%, have you done it right? Is it correct? Of the 64%, have you missed a trick? Is there something you should have done? Should you have furloughed your staff? And of the 27% that are considering, well, I'm glad you're considering, because maybe you wanted to see what the guidance was going to tell you, and there's certainly something you're going to do in the future. So hopefully by the end of this section on furloughing, depending on where your results were individually, you may have to either ask yourself whether you need to furlough, whether you furloughed and you probably shouldn't have, if that was the case, or whether you should be considering furloughing. So hopefully by the end of the session, we'll be able to answer all of that. Now I'm just going to hide that poll now and get back to the slides. So fingers crossed you can see the slides. Perfect. Now then, I'm going to go through the original guidance that we all had when furloughing was announced. This sort of American term that is now used here every single day, or it seems to be. And the original guidance that was issued around furloughing had 2 items within it that specifically related to schools. And I cherry-picked 2 specific items there. And those 2 items were primarily funded by government agencies, should not be furloughing staff. And equally in there that no organisation should profit from the financial support on offered through the Coronavirus Job Retention Scheme, which is the furloughing scheme. And based on that, just got to click a button there. The Association of School and College Leaders, which I'm going to quote, came to the conclusion that furloughing wasn't an option for schools, and I completely at the time concurred and agreed with them. Based on that original government guidance that you received, furloughing was not an option for schools. So when I got a few phone calls from my clients about furloughing, and this was the guidance that was out, it was very straightforward, very obvious. Unfortunately, nothing for you to do, nothing for you to claim. You couldn't claim. And then the Department for Education got involved. And we had some lovely updated guidance from the DfE. And to be honest with you, they really put the cat amongst the pigeons here. And they seemed to drop a bit of a bombshell and run, because they produced some guidance, and this guidance was aimed at on the whole for early years. And this early years guidance said funding would continue for early years, and that was very gratefully received for all of the early years establishments that are with us here today. And furloughing was an option to consider. Now, when I read that guidance, my eyebrow obviously raised, and I thought, hold on, that guidance is completely and utterly contradicting the original government guidance that stipulated a primarily funded government department, of which a school is, effectively, and educational establishments are, would not be able to make a claim. So the DfE's own guidance was extremely contradicting, and it really did grey or muddy the water here. We didn't know which was right. And equally, if it was okay for early years, would it be okay for everybody in the education establishment? Now, I know full well that there are a number of local authorities that read this guidance and sent out a number of emails to all of the early year establishments and said, you'd be pleased to know your funding is going to continue during this difficult time, and you should consider furloughing your staff where appropriate. And I am aware of a number of schools and a number of nurseries that on the back of that email and this guidance did furlough their staff. Now, what we had after that was the latest guidance that was issued about, I want to say a week and a half ago, and it's one of the reasons why this webinar actually was delayed by a couple of days, because we had to incorporate the latest guidance. And the latest guidance issued by the DfE clarified the position and advised that furloughing was an option for some schools, nurseries and education establishments. And that's the latest guidance that we have at the moment. So just to recap on the guidance here, and I'm going to try and use a pen here, but my writing with a mouse is absolutely appalling. The original government guidance stipulated on the whole that you could not raise a claim for furloughing, so no. Then we had the DfE early years guidance that said you most certainly could consider raising a claim, and I'm going to apologise obviously for writing with a mouse. That's a yes, hopefully you can see it. And then we've got this latest guidance from the DfE that says, and it just gets worse, doesn't it, my writing, but you can all have a chuckle with this, which is a maybe. So based on this, I would be absolutely amazed if you got any of this correct. Why? Because you've been given every single answer there can be on this, which is no, yes, and maybe. It's utter madness, it's a little bit bonkers, but you can sort of forgive the DfE here. All of this guidance is coming out at breakneck speed, and as a result of that, there is always going to be errors and mistakes. Now, what I've done here is I've put a link to the latest guidance on the screen. So if you did want to go and have a look at it, you're more than welcome. And you'll see that's a common theme throughout this webinar on the slides. If I do refer to some guidance, I will put it on the screen so that you can have a look at it at your leisure. So let's go into a bit more detail around the latest guidance. Now, what the DfE have done with the latest guidance has acknowledged that schools have lost an element of their income. And this, on the whole, is private income in a sense of parental contributions towards nursery costs, whether that be before and after school clubs, meal costs, trading income, and other services that schools may have. And it is potential that certain staff are actually paid from this private income. And where staff are paid from this private income rather than from government funding, it may be appropriate to furlough staff in those circumstances, but only when all other areas and avenues have been considered, especially for the payment of their wages. Now, the DfE has listed 5 conditions that all establishments have to follow when making a coronavirus job retention scheme claim. Now, I've put the 5 conditions on the screen there. I'm not going to go through every single one, but I'm going to mention 1 or 2 and possibly even 3 of them, to be honest, really. So the first one, the employee works in the area where services are temporarily not required and the salary is not covered by public funding. So let's just say your school is closed. Your teachers would not be able to make a claim here. You wouldn't be able to make a claim for your teachers because your teachers' salaries on the whole are covered by public funding, even though your school is temporarily closed. The second point, employees would otherwise be made redundant or laid off. So the interesting one on this one is you most certainly wouldn't be sacking any staff in the sense of teaching staff, but you may have considered temporarily laying off nursery staff, performance after school staff, some sort of element of support staff here. So it could be that you could have temporarily laid off or made redundant some staff. I'm going to skip the 3rd point and go to the 4th point, which says that the grant from the coronavirus job retention scheme would not lead to financial reserves being created. In other words, you shouldn't be profiteering or profiting from making any claim. But they are the 5 conditions that you do need to meet when considering and when making a coronavirus and furloughing claim here. Now, if you do make a claim, how much is it? Well, we all know the DfE and we all know how they like to have their own calculations. I'm still very upset over the teachers' pay grant and how they seem to calculate that one. Well, true to form, the DfE have done it yet again. They've got their own specific calculation just for you. And it's a restricting calculation. In other words, you should calculate the normal furloughing calculation, 80%, £2,500, but there's an additional calculation you need to do just for education establishments. And what they're saying here is there is a maximum claim you can make, which is a percentage of the total other income compared to total overall income. And you're probably thinking, what do I mean here? So I'm going to take you through a simple example really here. So we've got School A. School A has got total income in a month of £250,000. So let's just say this is a small primary here. You can obviously scale it up if you're a secondary or some sort of other establishment. So total income received normally in a month, £250,000. And that's all private income and education income, so government funded income as well. Of that £250,000, £10,000 relates to the private elements, those parental contributions, those trading items that you possibly have. Now, if we divide one by the other, simple maths, even I can do it, so you should be able to, that gives you a percentage of 4%. Hopefully you're all with me so far. If your school had a monthly wage bill of £175,000, that does seem comparable if total income was £250,000, then the restricted claim would be £7,000. That's 4% of £175,000. So if I had furloughed, let's just say 4 or 5 members of staff, maybe those members of staff were from my nursery or from my before and after school club, and I've done the usual calculation, 80% or £2,500, whichever is the lower, and that total came to £9,000. I couldn't claim £9,000. I have to apply this calculation. The maximum I can claim is £7,000 through the scheme. All I can say is thank you to the Department of Education for complicating matters even further here. But you're not surprised, I'm sure, and neither am I. So let's answer some questions I've received, and I'm going to launch a poll and ask you to answer this one in a minute. So here's a question I got asked. My nursery is 100% funded through the local authority. We have practically no parental contributions, other income coming in here. we're not open for key workers, and I furloughed all of my nursery staff. So I'm going to launch a poll now. Oh, bear with me. I don't know whether I shared. I certainly didn't share the furloughing poll. Oh, my apologies here. That was the poll from the furloughing here. So you can see there that most people didn't furlough staff. I'm going to close that. If I have shared it, my apologies. It seemed to indicate it wasn't shared there. So let's go through to this one. So nursery. Nursery funded 100% by LA, not open for key workers. All staff have been furloughed. Is that correct? Yes or no? 4% have voted, 6%. Go on, give it a go. Doesn't matter. No one else gets to see what your answer is here. Can you furlough staff? Yes, no, maybe. Going to give it a few more seconds. I think one person can't do the poll. Sorry about that. For some reason, your poll's not working. I think you're all virtually done there. So I'm going to close that poll, and then I'm going to immediately share it with you. And I think we've got an overall winner there. The overall winner being no. I think that's 86%. I can't really see the percentage on my screen. It's a little bit too small. But the overall winner obviously is no. I'm going to hide that. Hopefully that's hidden. Perfect. We're back to the slides. And the answer is, I think you won't be surprised, is no. Why? Well, this is income received from state, from government. It's 100% funded through the local authority. And as a result, those workers should not, on the whole, be furloughed based on the new guidance. Strangely enough, based on the old guidance, it might have been slightly different, the middle guidance, but the current guidance, it would be a potential no in, well, lots of circumstances and virtually all circumstances there. Now, a second question I've often had asked me, but I'm not going to ask you to answer this one, is can I furlough staff who are not working nor on my rota to come into my school? And the answer to that one is maybe. It depends on the type of staff and if they meet all those 5 conditions that I set out earlier on. Obviously, there's certain staff that most certainly would not be able to be furloughed, teaching staff being one of them, and those that are paid on the whole through government funding. But there could be staff which could make a claim who were not on your rota. And that might be nursery staff, because maybe your nursery is not open. Or maybe you have certain staff coming in, but certain staff not coming in with your nursery. Now, the third question I've got in front of me here, my school has a performing after-school club and have dedicated staff that cannot work. My overall budget is showing a deficit for the year, and I'm unable to meet the salary costs from other means. Can these staff be furloughed and a claim made? And the answer to that one is highly likely, really there. Why? Well, you've got dedicated staff that are normally funded through private income, through income from parental contributions. Your budget is showing a deficit, so you certainly don't have a surplus. You're not gaining financially here. You're unable to meet their costs from other means. So you've obviously explored other areas. Can these staff be furloughed and a claim made? Well, potentially. You've still got to meet all those conditions that I said earlier on. You've still got to comply with the restriction, but it might be worth reviewing. Hopefully, that has answered some of the questions you may have had on furloughing. Now, I know that we've got some questions that have been asked specifically, and I'll try to answer those at the end for those individuals that have raised some questions on furloughing. But on the whole here, I would be astonished and amazed if you have got this right, because the guidance has changed so dramatically from the original guidance to the revised guidance to the current guidance here. It's practically impossible to have got this right from day one of furloughing guidance coming out. What you need to ask yourselves are for the ones that potentially have furloughed staff, have you done so correctly? And does it mean that actually you don't need to furlough? You shouldn't be raising a furlough claim now. For those that haven't furloughed, could you furlough? Is there anything you can consider here? And for the ones that are considering, obviously make sure that you comply with all the rules and regulations that you need to do. I know that we're probably all thinking, well, we're coming to the end of this crisis. I think someone described it quite well the other day. We're not at the end. We're not at the beginning of the end. We're just maybe at the end of the beginning. We've certainly got potentially another month of lockdown and schools being closed, and then we've got phasing in coming in. So it could be that there is furloughing claims to be had, and obviously only you can answer whether it's appropriate for your school and establishment. So let's move on to the next item, which is agency costs and agency workers here. And the reason for me putting this on the agenda is because I was inundated with a number of phone calls on this topic and whether schools should be paying agencies during this period of time. So it's worthwhile going through what you should be doing and see whether you are complying with the rules or not. So I'm going to ask a question again, and hopefully I'll be able to share it. So just bear with me one moment whilst I try to multitask. And I'm going to launch another poll. Hopefully you should see that now. Has your school stopped, delayed payments to agencies as a result of the current situation? Yes, no, unsure. Let's have a little bit of a stab at that one. There's quite a few of you that voted already. Oh, interesting results here coming through. I will share them in a moment. 40% of you have voted. The rest of you are trying to frantically click a button. Hopefully it's working. It's going up and down in areas. Oh, it's interesting. We're going to have some interesting debates on this topic in a minute, I'm sure. 50% have voted, and there's a few people still voting. I'm just going to leave that open for probably 5 more seconds. 5, 4, 3, last chance, 2, 1. Going to close that poll. And I'm going to share it with you. Hopefully you can see this on your screen now. And what a result from that poll, really. Complete and utterly mixed answers from there. 40-odd% yes, 40-odd% no, and some of you either not knowing what's going on or deciding to stay on the fence. And half of you didn't even vote on that one. I had a 50% vote for that one. So some of you have either can't click the button or didn't want to vote on that one. But it's quite an interesting result there. 50-50 really between yes and no. Well, just clicking another button there. So it's worthwhile just going through exactly what is going on with agencies and what you should be doing, and to see whether those people that have delayed agency costs should have, for those that haven't delayed, whether you should have. Okay. Now I've put a little bit of a statement on the screen here, and I don't like this, so I'm going to explain it a different way, really. So if I'm under a temporary contract with you in your school and I'm on your books, so I'm being paid through your payroll as such, you are my direct employer. If that is the case, then you shouldn't be furloughing me and I should be paid as normal. I should be treated no differently from your teaching staff in that regard. I think that's fairly straightforward, although I don't like the statement that's on the screen at the moment. It does seem to complicate matters. However, most agency costs are not paid through payroll. Most agency costs are paid to a separate company that provides you with the staff. And there is specific guidance on the payment of other agency costs where the school is not the direct employer. I'll put the guidance on the screen here. It's a PPN note 0220, and it's a specific one for contingency agency workers impacted by the coronavirus here. And you're welcome to have a look at that at your leisure. Now, we believe there's 3 scenarios surrounding agency workers and agency costs. And those three scenarios I'll link back into that guidance. So we've got scenario number one. I'm going to talk you through the three scenarios. Scenario number one is where you've got live assignments with agency workers that can work. So those that can work, but maybe they're not in work because your school is closed, but they can work. And in those circumstances, you still should be paying the agency. It is very, very straightforward. The guidance is very clear here, and it says the agency workers should be paid as normal by the agency, and you should still be paying the agency. The agency should not furlough that worker and should not be claiming through the coronavirus job retention scheme. It does seem a little bit mad, but what the government is trying to do here is to ensure the continuation of the supply chain for schools and for agencies, effectively saying you should be paying them for a service that naturally would be occurring if we weren't under this lockdown, your school wasn't closed as such. The second scenario is where those agency workers cannot work. So maybe they are ill, maybe they've got coronavirus and they cannot work. Now, in those circumstances, what has to happen is that the agency needs to calculate an amount. Now, the PPN, the guidance, sets out that amount at 80% or £2,500. Now, that rings a bell. That sounds like a furlough claim, but strangely enough, it's not. It is not the furlough scheme. They're just trying to offer the same amount to those agency workers that cannot work as the individuals that would be claiming through the furlough scheme. So if you've got a worker who cannot work but is on live assignment as such, what should be happening is the agency should calculate the 80% of the £2,500 plus their fees that they would normally charge, and then send you the bill for that, and you should still be paying it. They should have an open book policy, so they should provide you evidence here that the individual has still been paid and they have not raised any sort of furlough claim. So you can probably see what's going on here is there is no furloughing claim happening on the whole for agencies. The government is being very clear here that you should continue to pay agencies on these basis, or on this basis rather. And then we get on to the third example, or the third scenario, which is those that are not on live assignments. So in other words, let's just say someone's assignment has come to an end and it hasn't been renewed as such. Now, on the whole, yes, there's nothing for the school to pay, and those individual workers can be furloughed through the job retention scheme by their agency. I think Martin Lewis, Money Supermarket Man, he had this on his program the other night for those supply teachers who are not in work and they're having to follow the furlough claim, and likelihood is they're paid minimum wage when they're not in school, so poor them. But this is for those that are not on live assignments. Now, there is a caveat here for those not on live assignments, and I'm going to bring up the caveat in a few moments' time because you may be shocked by that caveat. Oh, just clicking a button again. So I've got a question for you. I'm going to launch a poll here. I have a live contracted agency worker deployed as a one-to-one support. The child is no longer in school, so the agency worker is not required. I've not paid the agency. The agency has furloughed the worker as a result. Is that correct or not? What do you think? I'm going to launch a poll again. Hopefully I'll get the right one here. And it comes up on your screen. Have a little go. What do you think? Is it correct? Should they have not paid the agency and the agency furloughed the staff as a result? What do you think? The results are coming in. We've got quite a few results. You obviously like clicking the button on your computer there. Oh, a few more people have voted this time around than the last time, which is good. I'm just going to leave that open for probably another 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, last chance to vote, 2, 1. I'm going to close it down now and I'm going to share that with you. There's the results. the vast majority of you saying, no, it is not correct. And I am with you there. So let me just hide that. And the answer is, no, it's not correct. It's not the agency worker's fault that the child isn't in school as a result of COVID-19. And if you follow the guidance, then that agency worker should continually be paid by the agency. The agency should charge you, and you should pay the agency. It may sound a little bit wrong, but that is the guidance. That's what you should be doing. Just because the agency work is not working for you or not in school doesn't mean that you shouldn't be paying the usual agency costs. You are still receiving your income. And if you didn't pay the agency, but you would have if that one-to-one child had been in your school, surely you financially gained from the current situation. Second question here. My agency worker's assignment was coming to an end. Do I have to continue to pay the agency beyond that point? Now, I was tempted to ask a question for you here, but I thought that would be rather cruel with this one, because the answer is maybe. And I mentioned a caveat early on that last point, and this is the caveat. So let's just go through the scenario here. If a contract was coming to an end naturally, and let's just say pupils leaving and therefore that contract was ending and it had nothing to do with the current situation, then the answer is no, you don't have to pay the agency beyond that point. However, if the agency assignment came to an end and you didn't renew it because of the current situation only, because maybe if I take the previous question as an example, that one-to-one support wasn't needed because the child isn't in school, then you still should be paying the agency. And that is the caveat when it comes to that scenario. So only you can answer whether you should be paying agencies. Hopefully, that has answered a lot of the confusions and questions around agency costs and whether you should be paying them. Now, if you have any lawyers with us today, they would normally go, hold on, the agencies haven't provided a service. And under contract law, you don't have to pay it. Well, in normal circumstances, yes. And if you're a business, most certainly, yes. But we're talking about specific guidance that have been issued for public sector bodies, and that is you. And therefore, you should be following this guidance. And on the whole, this guidance says you should continue to pay agency costs throughout this crisis, effectively. Okay, that's the two main areas dealt with. I think I've taken a little bit longer than expected, so we'll whiz through the next areas. Exceptional costs and funding. Now, we all probably know that there is funding available for schools and for those extra costs that have been suffered as a result of coronavirus and COVID-19. And those costs are, on the whole, three main areas. And those areas are increased premises costs, and that on the whole is hand sanitizers, really. I know a lot of secondaries were dishing them out left, right and centre outside every single classroom. I dread to think how much cost they spent on those, but you can make a claim for those items. We've got free school meals additional costs. Now, this is where the voucher scheme wasn't up and running or is inappropriate, and you've suffered costs for dealing with that. And then the third point there is additional cleaning. And when we say additional cleaning here, we're talking about where there has been a suspected or actual COVID claim in your school, and you've had to get it deep cleaned or a specialist company in. Now, there are some restrictions on your exceptional cost claims. There's a funding cap, and that cap is based on the size of your school, the number of pupils, but it's quite generous in my opinion. The cap is from 25,000 through to 75,000. So I will be shocked if you spent £25,000 on hand sanitizers. I know there's a premium on them at the moment. But I suppose if you had some specialist company come in and desanitize your school, then that could be a very costly exercise. There is a second restriction, which I think is a little bit naughty, really, here, and I put it on the screen now, which is no claim can be made where a school has a surplus. Now, I read that and I was a little bit cheesed off, and I'm sure you would be. Now, what they're talking about here is if you've got a surplus carried forward, that's fine. But if you've got an in-year surplus, you should not be making a claim against additional costs. A little bit naughty, but I don't make these rules, sadly. So you need to establish whether your school has got a surplus in the year before you make any exceptional costs and funding towards the extra costs you have suffered as a result of COVID-19. The guidance, again, I put on the screen, so you're more than welcome to go through it at your leisure. If you have suffered any other costs not listed on the 3 areas or 3 items, should I say, then you can email the DFE and they've got a specific email address for you there. Now, if you do make a claim and you're thinking about making a claim, there is some bookkeeping you need to do. And there's effectively 3 things you need to do. The first thing is keep a record of all related expenditure. Now, that seems quite obvious, but what they actually mean by this is that that expenditure should be shown separately. So if you're running an accounting system, within your accounting system, you may have a dedicated nominal or line or area that you put in all of the COVID expenditure costs to, so it is shown separately within your financial system. So whatever that may be, PS Financials, HCSS, Capita, Xero, whatever you're using, you should have a separate line to cover those costs. The second thing you need to do is to ensure that all of those costs are specifically authorised for a claim. Now, you're probably thinking, well, all of my invoices are authorised, so I just need to get my head teacher or the relevant authority body just to sign it off. Well, no, what they're saying is they have to specifically authorise it for a COVID claim. So not just a signature, but someone to acknowledge that they've reviewed that invoice and you can put a COVID claim for it. And thirdly, is that you should be able to match the income you received to the total expenditure. Now, I'm an accountant, I'm an auditor. When I come into schools and I know that some income should match expenditure, I get a little bit upset and I get a bit worried. So, for example, if you've received £10,000 to cover costs for COVID, yet your expenditure line for COVID shows 8, an eyebrow will go up by me and I'll go, what have you done? Something's wrong. So you've just got to be conscious there that you should be matching these things off, and hopefully it will all work. I think you'd be surprised on how many times income and expenditure doesn't match when they should do there. Hopefully that covers off the exceptional costs and funding. If I move on to DSG, this is very quick here, but I just wanted to raise an issue on this one here. The Department for Education has reconfirmed in black and white in no uncertain terms that all government funding will continue at normal rates. And the reason for me including that on the slide here is I know a number of local authorities, not in this area, that have told their schools that they will not be passing on the high needs funding. And that is completely and utterly wrong. They should not be doing so. Thankfully, I think Cheshire West, Cheshire East, Wirral, Halton and Shropshire councils, they've been very good. I haven't heard that in this area, but I have heard it from 3 councils, Midlands and down south, that initially said they wouldn't be passing on that high need funding, and the schools have had to kick back, refer to the guidance and say, actually, you're obliged to pass on that funding to us. Moving on to governance and internal reviews. The DFE has issued some specific guidance on governance during COVID-19. It is a small document, to be honest, but what they have said is that you must continue financial oversight during this period. They do acknowledge that it's impossible to have meetings, it's impossible to do certain things, and therefore you can be a little bit flexible and there's a pragmatic approach to these things, but you should still retain financial oversight during this period. Interestingly, they've also said that you should have contingency plans in case chairs and vice chairs become unavailable, but they haven't mentioned heads or deputies or school business managers or those sort of things, which is a bit of a surprise. I think that's just accepted that you should have contingency plans in place. Yes, they've mentioned chairs and vice chairs there. Equally, I put the guidance on the screen here so you can download it at your leisure if you need to and want to. Now, for those academies that are with us, you've had a dedicated letter sent just for you. The CEO of the Education and Skills Funding Agency has sent a letter to all accounting officers of academies, saying to them that they should be following the Academy Financial Handbook during this time, although they will allow an element of flexibility, really. They have acknowledged that it's a time of year when there's normally internal scrutiny going on within schools and academies, as such, in other words, a third party coming in, and that is not possible during this current time. They have mentioned remote checks, but interestingly, the CEO of the ESFA made a clear statement in her letter to say that she's going to leave it up to boards to decide on whether remote checks are feasible. Now, when I read that, I thought, hold on, if we're saying that physical checks are impossible and remote checks may not be feasible, does that mean that no checks are required during this current period? And I think the answer to that one is no, that's probably not what she meant. What she meant was you should be doing things a little bit differently. In other words, maybe you don't need your external auditors coming in to have a bit of say that, but you may choose to focus on policy reviews, risk management, risk statements during those times, and maybe your auditors can actually review that rather than trying to have remote checks, which are very difficult and timely and costly. Again, I've put a copy of the letter that has been sent out to all accounting officers on the screen. I appreciate that is just for the academies that are with us today. Moving on to data collections, the DFE are acknowledging that you've got an awful lot to do and you're doing it in very difficult circumstances, often at home. And what it's trying to do is reduce the burdens on schools, academies and education establishments during this time. So what they've done is reduce that bureaucracy. They have effectively cancelled a whole host of items. They have deferred some more items, and they've not yet decided on one or two others, really. And I've cherry-picked a handful just to go through with you. And I've tried to cherry-pick one or two to cover each different scenario, depending on who we've got online with us today. So for the academies that are with us, you probably had a hooray when you heard that the budget forecast outturn report was cancelled this year, that you didn't need to do it. I'm sure you had an extra glass of wine that night in celebration. School census, the summer school census, that's been cancelled. That was a bit of a surprise. Key stage 2 teaching assessments, well, that's not a surprise that one has been cancelled. For those that have been paused until the 30th of June, so paused items, don't need to do them at the moment, until at least the 30th of June. We've got the financial management and governance self-assessment review for academies. That one's been paused to the 30th of June. For diocese schools, we've got capital grants and assurance reviews. They've been paused. And for mainstream, consistent financial reporting and submissions have been paused till June as well. So one example for quite a few different scenarios there. When it comes to deferred decisions, the academies in the room will probably be watching this one closely, which is a 3-year return. They've yet to decide on what to do with that one. It was due to open on the 30th of June with a filing date on the 31st of July. Wait and see what goes on that one. I think you'll be delighted if that one gets cancelled. Now, I put a link again to all of those items. I've literally just cherry-picked 1, 2 or 3 items there for each one. The list is absolutely huge, to be honest, of all those items that have been cancelled and deferred. It's well worth looking at. It's well worth going to see, reviewing to see which items you do and do not have to do going forward. I think you might be surprised by that one. Just moving on to revised budgets and planning here. I think it's quite obvious that you're going to have to recast your budgets and redo your budget. You certainly can't make a financial claim without proving that you're running a deficit, without proving that you've not got a surplus as such. So you will be frantically running your budget to see whether you can actually make a claim through the schemes, because if you're showing a surplus, sadly, it looks like you can't. And what they have said, you should be returning to daily life. Well, I read this and I was a bit miffed at this one, to be honest, because they're talking about returning to daily life on the financial implications of doing so. Well, we don't know enough about what's going to happen yet to do that. We've heard of a staggered phased return, but we don't know what the financial implications are going to be. And I think you don't know what the financial implications are going to be when it comes to a phased return. But they are encouraging you to plan for return to daily life. That'll be a phased return and then full return, and to see what your financial positions should be so that you do know what's going on. Now, for those academies that are with us today, the Teachers Pension Scheme End of Year Certificate, academies only here, that is due by the end of May, so please don't forget that one. I'm not aware that that's been deferred or cancelled just yet. And then that same form needs to be audited by the end of September, but that's a long way off yet. But please don't forget to submit the return by the 29th of May. It's difficult to forget things when you're sat at home and not in your office. You will be delighted to know that we're almost at the end, a little bit longer than I expected. I do hope that you enjoyed that webinar. I hope that you learned something from it. I hope it answered some of the questions you may have. I hope that you can take a number of things from it and maybe ask some questions at school. I'm sure there's lots of debate and discussion going on, and hopefully,
hello, Rain, it's Cara. Just giving you a call. Can you give me a call back, please? I'm available on this one. Yes, fine.
All feedback is gratefully received. If you do have any feedback, good, bad or ugly, send it on. We always look to improve. If we can do something differently to make it better, we will do so. So here's the email address to send the feedback to. If you have any specific questions or you do want to give me a call and talk about any issues, my contact details are on the screen now for you to enable you to email me or call me. Even my mobile is there on the screen. And future webinars, if you've got any topics or ideas or issues you want us to discuss, we'll happily do a webinar on it. We have got an academy only financial update coming at the end of May, beginning of June. There's a whole host of items to include in that one. New Academy Financial Handbook, changes to auditors where you can't do the internal and external audit, risk assessment changes, lots of good things coming up in that one, but that is just for the academies with us rather than the mainstream. I do hope you've enjoyed that. Now, what I will do is I'll spend a bit of time now just answering the questions. I'm probably going to mute my mic and turn off my web cameras so you can't see me or hear me. You're welcome to stay online. I'll try and answer some of the questions. Equally, you can pop off and I'll email you with the answers if you're not around. Thank you all very much for joining us today. Please stay safe, and hopefully I shall see you all very soon. Bye.
Hi, Lorraine. I'm good, thank you. How are you? Oh dear. Oh dear. Yeah. Yeah.